As AAA gaming goes the way of spectacles and indie gaming continues to play the same hand of cozy games and nostalgia bait, one genre in particular has been noticeably missing for what feels like eons now. Where are the vehicular combat games? Well, there used to be one franchise that us PlayStation fans could reliably depend upon every generation, and it was the oldest PlayStation IP that we had grown to love, Twisted Metal. Yet that all went away some years ago now, and despite our cries today for a new game, Sony just doesn't seem interested in the slightest. Welcome to MojoPlays. My name is Ty, and today we're investigating the long and tumultuous struggle behind Twisted Metal. Does the franchise still hold weight today, or have the nostalgia goggles warped our perception? Before we begin, we publish new videos all week long, so be sure to subscribe to MojoPlays and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos. When it comes to humble beginnings, few PlayStation IPs get any more humble than Twisted Metal, and that is no overstatement. A young man named David Jaffe had already spent some time in game development working on games like Cliffhanger, Skyblazer, and Mickey Mania before being hired by Sony as a tester. As part of Sony's efforts to let PlayStation kick the door down and compete with Nintendo, Jaffe was put in charge of developing one of the console's very first games, and he would lead the charge for an external team located at SingleTrack, a studio based in Salt Lake City, Utah. The team only had a little under 12 months to get something going. Ideas came and went, but one day, as Jaffe and some of his colleagues were driving back from Salt Lake City on the notorious Interstate 405, they came up with a brilliant idea. A game where you could disrupt day-to-day life with cars armed to the teeth, with guns, napalm, and explosions. Though it was met with a little bit of pushback from a couple of folks at SingleTrack, the pitch ultimately won, and would be developed with a budget of only $850,000. Twisted Metal was revealed to the world during the first annual E3 in 1995, held in bright and sunny Los Angeles before it finally launched on November 10th, 1995. Quote, "Another showcase title for the PlayStation," end quote, said magazine publication Next Generation. Electronic Gaming Monthly awarded the game a 9.25 out of 10, an insanely high score for a launch game at the time. The only complaint among critics was that it was a short game, and even then, that complaint was rare to hear from anybody who played it. Twisted Metal had contributed a massive boost in profits for Sony, alongside Warhawk, another PlayStation title. The two games generated roughly $28 million in revenue by the end of 1996. Development for Twisted Metal 2 began almost immediately after launch. Now, normally this is where we could accelerate the story and say Sequel A led to Sequel B, which wasn't as good, but then we got Sequel C, and that's where everything fell apart. However, one could see a faint sign that Twisted Metal was going to face a long-term struggle just from one development hurdle Twisted Metal 2 faced: identity. The plan for Twisted Metal 2 was pretty cut and dry. What else do you do with a blockbuster hit such as this? Scale down? No. You go big or you go home. Jaffe and his team at SingleTrack wanted to get crazier with the vehicle designs. Look at concept art for Twisted Metal and Twisted Metal 2, and you'll see that there were plans between both games for hovercrafts, bug-like vehicles, helicopters, and more that were honestly somewhat unrealistic and a little too wacky for the franchise's identity at this time. And so, many of them were scrapped in favor of monster trucks, construction vehicles, hearses, and, oddly enough, a vehicle where the driver is bound to two enormous wheels. Weird, yes, but still fitting for the mildly dark humor the original Twisted Metal had presented. Twisted Metal 2 launched on November 8th, 1996, and was met with near-universal acclaim, though reviews weren't as over-the-moon about it compared to the predecessor. Graphics were slightly better and the controls were a bit smoother, but overall, the only key features were the more interesting vehicle designs and the litany of new levels based on real-world locations. Other than that, the only major complaint was just how much more difficult Twisted Metal 2 was. While it did offer an easy setting, the game would cut your campaign short and tell you to get good and play on medium or hard to properly finish the rest of the game. Some folks weren't too crazy about this demand. The few that took up the challenge have come back and reported rage-inducing fights, particularly the ones in Holland, Hong Kong, and the final fight against Darktooth. Cheat codes were a player's best friend for this game, and even with this sharp spike in difficulty, the game still sold gangbusters. But what happened after all of this was where Twisted Metal truly began its own twisted descent into an extensive identity crisis. After Twisted Metal 2's own commercial success, Single Track suddenly got bought out by GT Interactive, the publishing firm of Atari that we know today as Atari Inc. Suddenly, Single Track was no longer allowed to work on Twisted Metal games, and so, Sony brought development in-house and tasked 989 Studios to develop Twisted Metal 3. Jaffe, on the other hand, remained as a Sony employee and would spend the next 4 years learning internal development. Now, at the time, 989 Studios wasn't exactly known for quality games, at least not yet with the MLB The Show games. Yes, some folks reminisce over Jet Moto, Rallycross, Siphon Filter, or maybe even the often forgotten third-person shooter Blasto. However, none of their games were really resounding hits, and their quality seemed to get worse and worse with every new release. From Cardinal Sin to the Extreme series, 989 Studios got way more poor review scores than mildly positive ones. Why they were given the keys to the Twisted Metal Kingdom is anyone's guess, quite frankly. But most video game companies, Sony themselves included, didn't really understand the business yet either. There was just a lot of spitballing and experimenting back in the 90s, you know? Twisted Metal 3 was released on November 10th, 1998, and was only made available in North America. Reviews were not kind, to put it gently. Critics noted the drastic change in tone as drivers and vehicles were glaringly wackier than the first two games were. The only thing heavy metal about this game was the soundtrack, which was loaded with Rob Zombie songs like Super Beast and Dragula. It was strange all around, and the lack of any innovation caused many to lose interest in the IP. That didn't stop Sony from greenlighting another sequel though, as TM3 managed to surpass 1 million copies sold. Almost exactly 1 year later, 989 Studios threw together Twisted Metal 4 and released it on November 16, 1999. This time around, 989 had leaned heavily into the cartoony demeanor and even attempted to throw in a custom vehicle builder, though it was ultimately about as bare bones as one would expect. Gone were the days of psychopaths and criminals tearing through the streets. Now we have big-headed clowns, parodies of pop culture characters, zany drivers with wild personalities, and more Rob Zombie than most had asked for. No diss against Rob Zombie, awesome musician, just why is he here? Critics, though, were generally pleased with the improvement in visual detail and physics, but ultimately, the game was no better or worse than TM3. Alarms had to have been going off at Sony because phone calls started being made to some familiar faces.
Days turn into months, months into years, desire turns into envy.
While 989 Studios and Sony attempted to drive Twisted Metal into the ground, Jaffe had gone back to his cozy desk at Sony to work on other things. Scott Campbell, Twisted Metal's other creator, had remained at Single Track and attempted to carry on the studio's notoriety as a vehicular combat developer. Unfortunately, Critical Depth and Rogue Trip Vacation 2012 didn't pan out. The former received polarizing reviews for its attempt at submarine-based combat, while the latter was much more appealing due to the similarities between it and Twisted Metal. Regardless, neither game sold too well. Campbell and a handful of other Single Track staff members wound up leaving to start up Incognito Entertainment. As Single Track withered away with 3 more games before its closure in 2000, Sony quickly got Campbell on the horn and pulled Jaffe from his desk to get the ball rolling on a new Twisted Metal, the first one to be made by its own creators since 1996. Twisted Metal Black was the evolution the IP desperately needed. Sony wasn't far from launching the PlayStation 2, but if they could, perhaps they could repeat the success of Twisted Metal and the first PlayStation console.
Recently, Sony Computer Entertainment convinced the creator of the series, Dave Jaffe, to design a new, darker, more intense version of the game for the PlayStation 2.
Thanks to the advancements in technology, Jaffe, Campbell, and the rest of the team sought to create the biggest Twisted Metal game that the franchise had ever seen. What other ways could Twisted Metal get a bigger boost in replay value? The answer was simple: larger levels, compelling stories for each character, new game modes, and even split-screen co-op. But once again, Twisted Metal was taking on a brand new identity, and this time it was more violent, more disturbing, and much, much more visceral. You could say it was vehicular combat with more of a horror edge. Twisted Metal Black released on June 19, 2001, and it saw the best critical reception the franchise had ever seen.
As Kelly went under, I heard her shouting to me, "You get them," she said. "You make them pay for this."
Some outlets even went as far as to award it perfect scores for its exceptional visuals, haunting sound design, unique blend of horror and dark humor, and thrilling challenge. Within 5 years, TMB managed to generate more than $30 million and would be remembered as one of the best PS2 games and one of the first major glimmers of hope that online gaming could work for home consoles.
I never used to believe in curses, but it's been 3 months since that night, and the pain gets worse every day.
Before the series could march forward, however, the original PlayStation needed just one more Twisted Metal game before it was taken to pasture. Twisted Metal Small Brawl was developed by an entirely different team at Incognito Entertainment and suffered a similar fate as TM3 and TM4. When it launched months after TMB, Small Brawl was met with scathing reviews, poor sales, and near instant rejection from fans for its cartoony, kid-friendly nature. As expected though, a sequel for TMB was well underway. Ideas were in place to take the franchise into a more open setting, influenced by the worldwide phenomenon called Grand Theft Auto 3. Levels were going to be interconnected to create something truly immersive, just as Rockstar Games did with GTA.
Remember, no one messes with my girls.
There were even talks about letting the player roam around other levels outside of the vehicle, an idea some might deem blasphemous to the Twisted Metal identity. Eventually, the scope creeped up, development became tumultuous, and the project lost direction. Jaffe, still a Sony employee, would go work with Sony Santa Monica on futuristic racing game Kinetica before they developed the legendary God of War. As for the folks at Incognito Entertainment, they would develop the 3D brawler War of the Monsters and the motorbike racing game Downhill Domination. Luckily, Twisted Metal wouldn't spend too long collecting dust.
Your prize, one wish. Let the games begin!
Towards the end of God of War's development, Jaffe would work with Campbell and the rest of the Incognito team for another game, but under the name of a different studio called Eat Sleep Play. Incognito was purchased by Sony in 2002, but the company would be absorbed into Sony Computer Entertainment America. Twisted Metal would make its PSP debut while returning to an identity more in line with the first 2 games we experienced in 1995 and 1996. Twisted Metal Head On launched on March 24th, 2005. Fans and critics were happy to see something more akin to the classic installments, and the return of vehicle upgrades kept matches feeling rewarding. The integration of secret minigames, though, was hit or miss depending on who you asked. A PlayStation 2 port of Head On was released 3 years later, featuring a wealth of behind-the-scenes goodies about the cancelled TMB2 and even a short documentary about the series' history. However, a secret message was hidden inside said documentary, and it threw the community into a frenzy. Twisted Metal is coming on PS3.
Light 'em up, boys.
Sure enough, Sony made the big reveal at the end of their E3 2010 showcase with a hype trailer, a life-sized replica of Sweet Tooth, and series co-creator David Jaffe in tow. This was going to be the big return for the series we had been itching for since Twisted Metal Black. Unbeknownst to us, this would be the final attempt at establishing a proper identity. By this point, Twisted Metal had been a grounded game with some dark humor and violence, wacky and zany like some fever dream cartoon made for kids, a horrific and gritty world plagued by the most notorious inmates from Blackfield Asylum, and back to semi-realistic violence with a visual aesthetic similar to comic books. What fusion could we witness with this long-awaited PS3 rendition? Online multiplayer.
We look forward to writing a whole new chapter together. Thank you very much.
Yes, online multiplayer was a big focus for the new game, and with that focus came some very glaring sacrifices. Folks were dismayed to learn that vehicles were the main focus and that you would only be able to drive as one of 4 playable factions, not characters, factions, led by Sweet Tooth, Dollface, Mr. Grimm, or Preacher. The likes of Agent Stone, Krista Sparks, and Mr. Slam had been replaced by generic characters for the sake of online multiplayer simplicity. While the new nuke mode looked cool and all, this sacrifice was not worthwhile to many fans. Rest assured, a single-player campaign was still included with all of the local multiplayer accoutrements we had been wanting, but the worst was yet to come. The game we commonly dub as TM12 would launch on Valentine's Day 2012, and while the reviews were mixed, the player feedback would grow more resentful. As neat as it was for Twisted Metal to finally include a playable helicopter, it wound up breaking the game online as it was hard for players in cars to stop, aim up, and shoot at helicopter players while trying to avoid attacks from other cars. As for the controls and physics, well, there was a lot of frustration and hostility towards players that used vehicles with high ramming power or magnet-based attacks like Roadboat had. Between the marketing and the reviews, the community quickly abandoned TM12. DLC was planned for the game, but by that point, sales had flatlined. According to Jaffe himself, the game did make its money back, but it wasn't enough to really call it a hit.
Oh, I know who you are. I know who you really are.
So we went from dark, yet humorous and familiar world with arcadey gameplay, to zany and wacky fun for the whole family, to horror-fueled action with disturbing imagery, back to handling the IP with kid gloves, literally, back to dark yet humorous and familiar world, and straight into the dark depths of online multiplayer. And that's really what happened to Twisted Metal. There was just never a clear direction as to what exactly this series is. Yes, we know it's car combat, but aside from Sweet Tooth and maybe Dollface and Mr. Grimm, there wasn't anything for players to really attach themselves to. Now, one could argue the vehicles are really what make Twisted Metal, but clearly that wasn't the case in TM12. Folks weren't crazy about the idea of playing as one of 4 generic goons, let alone the actual characters. And with the world and tones constantly changing, you have essentially created a franchise that has at least 5 different fan bases. You have those who loved TM1 and 2, those who championed Twisted Metal Black as the GOAT, those who adored Head On, and believe it or not, the small pool of people who actually did enjoy TM3, 4, and Small Brawl. What Sony has is the Superman ice cream of the PlayStation catalog, and it's a flavor that only very, very specific people want at very, very specific times. That said, how in the modern world of live service games can Twisted Metal ever make a comeback? What chance does it have when Sony flopped so hard with a completely different vehicular combat game in 2021? Granted, Destruction All-Stars is a unique case on its own, almost in a similar vein as the catastrophic Concorde. So is there a clear path? Maybe there is.
Bring that crew down. We've got a reputation to uphold.
In his current YouTube career, series co-creator David Jaffe has said that if Twisted Metal were to come back, live service elements would be needed, and that the IP would need something drastically different than anything on the market and something it has never done before.
If you're an executive at that company and you are basically being pitched, and this can't be happening. People are too smart. I know.
Although this writer believes differently. It may not be necessary to reinvent the wheel, but the argument for live service does hold weight here. Look at the success of modern vehicular combat games like Wreckfest or Crossout. While both are vastly different in vehicular combat in general, one has a sequel incoming, while the other is a free-to-play title that is still seeing updates 3 years after release. They may not have the massive budget Sony loves to burn away, and they don't make for massive money printers as Fortnite or Apex Legends does, but clearly, they are both making profit to warrant their respective efforts in post-launch support. What Sony needs to do is get a team that understands the series, and what the majority of the community likes about the series as a whole, before narrowing down ways to attract every corner of this fractured fanbase. A lot easier said than done, we know. Not only that, Sony might have to settle for, maybe not spending $300 or $400 million for a game that maybe only needs $50 to $100 million to make, instead of, again, burning up obscene amounts of money. Twisted Metal is going to need a budget title to make a proper comeback. Not a massive cinematic open world experience, a budget title. And if it pleases the right corners of the community, that word of mouth could slowly build the game into something massive. Think Dead by Daylight, and how that game went from being a short-term, experimental, asymmetrical multiplayer game to a horror powerhouse loaded with licenses to some of the biggest horror icons across all of entertainment.
You disappoint me. Is that the best you've got?
But who's to say? Maybe we all fell for Calypso's old wordplay trickery since we've spent the past decade wishing for Twisted Metal to come back. And it is back. We wished for it to come back, but did we want it in the form of a TV show? Not really, no. Show is pretty damn good though, not gonna lie. Can't wait for season 2.
No pressure or anything.
What do you think is the solution to resurrecting Twisted Metal though? Let us know down in the comments, and be sure to subscribe to MojoPlays for more great videos every day.